Okay, so we're going to move on to unitary states now. We're going to talk about two different types of states. So unitary states are our first one. So this is where power is centralized at the national level, which is also known as the federal level. And they have more uniform policies across the country. So policy within the whole country is typically going to be the same because the federal government is implementing it to the entire country. And it's going to be potentially more efficient in their policy making and coordination, which is just their enforcement, because you're not going to have local or regional governments to approve of the policy. Once it's passed through the federal legislature, and the executive approves it, it's passed across the whole country, typically. So it's very easy to pass more legislation and easier to enforce it because it's the same throughout the country. It's not different. Like in the United States, we're a federal country, so the laws in Georgia are different than that in South Carolina. So it's a little harder to enforce a lot of policy because a lot of laws are different. And I can in here in this picture, we can see that central government is being passed from high to low. That's typically how it works. It's not shared. It won't go from low to high, but it can go from high to low as they implement policy. And this doesn't mean that local governments don't exist. They do exist sometimes, but for the most part, they don't really do anything. So they have single legislative and administrative frameworks that are pretty efficient. As discussed earlier, if you have one body to pass laws instead of two, it's going to be easier to pass those laws. So in this course, our unitary states are China, Iran, and the United Kingdom. Now let's look at our federal states. These are different from unitary states. Federal states divide power. They share that power. It's not just concentrated in the local governments, but it's shared between the central and local governments. And they confer to a degree of local or regional autonomy in supplying typically social and educational services. Oftentimes it's more economic as well as religious in some areas, while also reserving powers for the national government. And I meant religious in like Nigeria, where the North has a lot more Muslim representation in the political system. So Muslim ideologies are going to be in mind more during the policymaking process in those states. Federal power always means it goes from high to low. That's not true. In this case, the power is shared, so it may go from low to high, high to low. It doesn't really matter. In our unitary states, as I discussed previously, it's going to go from high to low if it goes at all. Now, these states are more likely to address the minority and local concerns because those local governments are going to have more power to pass laws that are specific for those regions. So, as I discussed in Nigeria, we're going to have more Muslim ideologies in mind in the political system in the North and more Christian ideologies found in the political system in the South because the representation is more likely to be Christian. And these are Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. So I was discussing religious concerns earlier. Other local concerns could be like infrastructure development. So if one state in Mexico has very low amounts of infrastructure that's needed, so they're going to add in more infrastructure to support what's needed. But if another state doesn't need more infrastructure, they don't have to put in more infrastructure. So let's look at some examples here. So both the constitutions of Nigeria and of Mexico establish systems of federalism, that's what we call it, since both guarantee state governments in their respective countries. And they have certain powers. They don't have the exact same powers of the national government. They have certain powers, like collecting a state tax revenue. They do have federal tax revenues in these countries as well. Now, although Russia's constitution establishes federalism with protected powers of regional government, so they exist, they have some protected powers created by the constitution, President Putin and Russia's federal government have centralized powers considerably. So they have kind of stripped away some of these powers and centralized them considerably so they're more uniform across the country. And this was really influenced about in 2004 after a terrorist attack on school children in the North Caucasus region of Russia. As a result of this attack, the national government strengthened control over security, because that's kind of like a security concern, in Russia's regions and ended the direct election of the heads of Russia's regional governments. So instead of electing the regional government heads, there's a process now where they appoint these leaders with the approval of the national government. It's not that cool anymore. Not that democratic either. Yeah, power. So the degree to which power is centralized or decentralized in a government can change over time in both federal and unitary states. So in many cases, this reflects the state's response to internal and external actors like terrorism, or ethnic cleavages, or operations of supranational organizations like the European Union and other countries. So requests for autonomy, which is just more power essentially, in regions of the United Kingdom, so Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, has resulted in devolutionary processes. So that's a transfer of power from high to low. So each region has its own parliament, as we discussed earlier, or what we call these assemblies, and they have varying degrees of legislative authority. They don't have the exact same as the federal parliament, but they have some own authority over those regions. And this was, I guess we can say, as a result of ethnic cleavages due to desires for more autonomy by the Scottish people, by the Welsh people, and by the Irish people. Now, China has greater economic decentralization, which means their economy is less centralized. Makes sense. And they've had more local economic initiatives. We're looking to unify, but they're more regional-based policies. So we see experimentation in land reform policies and subsidies that will encourage businesses, particularly local businesses, to establish operations in specific regions. Sometimes local businesses, oftentimes those big manufacturing businesses, and they're going to operate in specific regions. Why? Because they can make more money, or they'll be provided subsidies, or land is cheaper, that sort of thing. These initiatives are found typically on the eastern end of China, closer to the coast, because it's easier to export and import goods and services at the coast. Now let's look at Putin a little bit. I reserved a whole slide for Putin because he's just that special. So Putin has used the Russian military to bomb Chechnya to enforce its position as part of the Russian Federation. So this is considered Russian territory, but they have not signed the treaty that joins the Federation. Putin passed a law to remove governors in the republics who do not follow the Russian constitution, essentially, in creating local law. I think that's what I was going to put. Just a typo. So if governors are kind of like, no, we're not going to do this, Putin's like, well, you're out of here. You're fired. Because, if you work for a job and you try to go in your own direction, your boss is going to fire you. That's essentially what's happening here. So in 2020, 7 federal districts were created, and all republics were placed into these districts, and they're run by presidential nominees. Let's talk about drugs, because everyone loves talking about drugs. So Mexico's efforts to combat drug trafficking have involved cooperation with the United States. They've joined various supranational organizations, and one that they're a part of with the United States now has helped with their drug trafficking, because it's also a big problem in the United States. The United States would like to get rid of drug trafficking as well. So hey, let's team up. We'll combat this problem together. So the federal government has sought to centralize security authority. It's not big of a deal that the federal government's getting a lot of involvement in this, and they've utilized the federal police and military in regions with high criminal activity. And this is kind of a map here showing the different drug cartels in Mexico. So not all of Mexico is dominated by drug cartels, but a good bit of it. And it's different cartels too. So different measures to get different cartels, because they're all different in how they act and that sort of thing. So yeah. Federal intervention has involved the suspension of local authorities, taking away that local power, and the appointment of federal officials to oversee security operations, making it a very big deal. Now let's look at resource allocation, which is just the provisioning of resources. So in Mexico, operations under what's known as fiscal federalism have occurred. So the federal government in the 31 states, and they have a federal district, which is Mexico City, they have roles in revenue generation and expenditure. So this system is intended to balance the financial needs of the different levels of government and ensure that resources are allocated efficiently. If you don't really understand what I'm talking about here, what essentially this means is that their fiscal policies in Mexico are kind of based up to the region. So if a region needs to spend more money on infrastructure, they can spend more money on the infrastructure. If a region needs to spend more money on education, they can spend more money on education. It's basing the needs of the region. So Mexico government is like, you know what? We're just going to increase education spending for the whole region, while some states may not need it. So this is really addressing the needs of the regions. And then, I'm going to try to pronounce this, guys. Ready? The Fondo de Estabilización de los Ingresos de las Entidades Federativas, I don't know, is an equalization fund. It's an economic fund aimed at addressing economic imbalances among the states. Because not all the states are at the same level of development. Their GDPs are not the same. Their economic development is not the same. Their growth is not the same. Some may have been declining at different years, at different times. So this is aimed at making sure that the economic disparities between the states are at a minimum. If states are declining while others are improving, they're going to try to not make the improving ones decline, but they're going to make the ones that are declining improve at a steady rate. In Nigeria, the federal government and the 36 state governments share responsibilities for managing and allocating revenue. I said share because, again, this is a federal system. Power is shared between the federal and state governments. And this is particular with natural resources such as oil. We'll learn more about how Nigeria does oil later, but oil is a pretty big resource in Nigeria. It's a good part of their GDP. So it's very important that there's revenue distributed equally, well, not equally, fairly for oil. So the 13% derivation principle allows oil-producing states, not all of the states are oil-producing, but a good bit of them are, and they receive a percentage of the revenue generated from oil resources in the region. So this means they're guaranteed a cut, which is important. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.